A construction crew outside Bielitz, Germany breaks ground on a new warehouse site. It's March 2025, and the work is routine: dig, pour, flatten, repeat 3 weeks into excavation. A backhoe operator named Klaus Wendt feels his machine lurch. Forward, the bucket punches through what should have been solid earth but isn't. Beneath the topsoil and clay, there's concrete, reinforced concrete, that has no business being in the middle of Brandenburg farmland, the foreman calls it, in assuming unexploded ordnance, a daily reality in this part of Germany, where the soil still bleeds iron from a war that ended 80 years ago. But when the bomb disposal unit arrives, they don't find a shell, they find a staircase sealed shut, buried under decades of sediment and silence, leading straight down into darkness. What they discover at the bottom will rewrite one of the Second World War's most enduring mysteries. 3 rooms carved into the earth-stale air that hasn't moved since 1945, rusted supply tins, a desk with a leather journal, and in the final room, slumped in a chair beside a dead radio set, a skeleton still dressed in the unmistakable uniform of a Wehrmacht Generalleutnant on his right hand, a signet ring engraved with 3 initials, WKD. For 80 years, no one knew what happened to this man. Governments searched, intelligence agencies theorized, families grieved, and conspiracy theories multiplied. But the answer was here all along, 6 feet beneath a quiet German field, waiting in the dark. This is the story of Generalleutnant Werner Karl Dreschner, the general who vanished, and the bunker that kept his secret for 8 decades. Werner Karl Dreschner was born in Potsdam in 1896 into a family where military service wasn't a choice, it was a bloodline. His father had served under the Kaiser, his grandfather before that. By the time Werner was 18, he was already in the trenches of the First World War, where he earned an Iron Cross second class at Verdun and came home with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life. Between the wars, he rose quietly through the ranks, not through ideology, but through competence. Dreschner was never the loudest voice in the room. He was the one people listened to when the loud voices stopped making sense. By 1942, he held the rank of Generalleutnant commanding divisions on the Eastern Front, where the fighting was brutal, and the margins for error non-existent. His men respected him, not because he gave rousing speeches, but because he brought them back alive. More often than not, Allied intelligence knew his name, but not the way they knew others. He wasn't on the list of war criminals or fanatical holdouts. The British Special Operations Executive described him in a classified memo as a pragmatic tactician, ideologically flexible and potentially cooperative. He was the kind of officer they wanted, sitting across a debriefing table, not hanging from a gallows, but Dreschner walked a razor's edge, and he knew it privately. He questioned the war's direction openly. He followed orders just enough to survive. The Gestapo's attention, he watched colleagues disappear for saying less than what he thought every night. And when the Eastern Front began to collapse in early 1945, Dreschner understood mething that many of his peers refused to accept. The war was over. The only question left was how you chose to die. And Werner Karl Dreschner had no intention of dying at all. By spring 1945, the Eastern Front wasn't a front anymore, it was a collapse. Soviet forces under Marshals Zhukov and Konev were pushing west with a momentum that nothing could stop. Berlin was the prize, and everyone knew it. Dreschner's sector sat east of the capital near the Seelow Heights, where the last organized German resistance was supposed to hold the line. But holding a line requires soldiers who believe in what they're fighting for and by. April 1945. Belief was a luxury. Nobody could afford desertion. Rates were staggering. Boys as young as 15 were being handed rifles and pushed toward positions that veterans had already abandoned the Volkssturm civilian militia. Units arrived with armbands and outdated weapons, looking more like refugees than reinforcements. Orders came down from Berlin, contradicting each other. Sometimes within hours, hold this position, retreat to that one counterattack. Here, stand and die there. Communication lines were cut daily, sometimes by Soviet artillery, sometimes by German units, cannibalizing wire for their own use. Dreschner watched it all from a command post that shrank by the day. On April 16th, the Soviet offensive at Silo Heights began, and the earth itself seemed to come apart, 1,000,000 men, and thousands of tanks grinding westward against a defense held together by threats and desperation. Dreschner received his final orders directly from High Command. Hold your position at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. Reinforcements are coming. Everyone in that room knew the reinforcements didn't exist. The order wasn't strategy. It was ritual. A dying regime issuing commands to men it had already sacrificed, Dreschner read. The dispatch folded it carefully and said nothing. His adjutant later recalled that the general stood at the window for a long time, staring east toward the sound of artillery. Then he turned and walked out of the room. No one in his staff could say with certainty what happened in the hours that followed. April 22nd, 1945, at 0347 hours, a radio operator at Wehrmacht Communications Relay Station, Adler, logged a transmission from Dreschner's command post. The message was brief, almost mechanical orders, acknowledged holding position. Dreschner, the operator, noted the time, stamped the log and moved on to the next frequency. He had no reason to think anything was unusual. Hundreds of similar messages passed through his station every night from commanders all along the crumbling front. But this one was different. This was the last time anyone would hear from Werner Karl Dreschner in the chaos that followed. Nobody noticed immediately. The Soviet breakthrough at Silo Heights had turned into a full advance, and German units were being overrun, scattered, or destroyed faster than anyone could track. When the remnants of Dreschner's division straggled westward over the following days, his staff was among them, his adjutant, Major Friedrich Hessler, his radio operator, Corporal Iden, his driver, Sergeant Brandt, all accounted for all alive. But when Allied forces later compiled their lie, STs and Soviet intelligence officers sorted through captured personnel, one name kept coming up without resolution. Dreschner wasn't among the captured. He wasn't among the dead recovered from the field. He wasn't among the wounded, filling hospitals on either side. His staff told consistent stories. The general had been at his command post on the evening of April 21st. By the morning of the 22nd, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no theatrics. His personal sidearm was missing, but his briefcase maps and personal photographs remained behind, as if he'd stepped out for air and never come back. The Soviets searched German prisoner columns for weeks, looking for high-ranking officers, trying to slip through. Unrecognized Dreschner's photograph was circulated to every checkpoint, every processing camp. Nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole, which, in a way, it had. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ends, but the accounting is just beginning. Allied intelligence teams fan out across the wreckage of the Third Reich, cataloging, capturing, and classifying every German officer they can find. The process is enormous and imperfect. Thousands of names on dozens of lists cross-referenced between American, British, French, and Soviet agencies. Some names get crossed off quickly, captured at this facility, surrendered at that checkpoint, found dead in this bunker. Others take longer. Men who slipped into civilian clothes and tried to disappear into the flood of refugees washing across the continent, but most are found eventually. The Allies are thorough, and the net is wide. Dreschner's name a P.R.'s on Soviet wanted lists. Under the category Senior Wehrmacht Officers, whereabouts unknown, the British have him flagged as a person of interest. For debriefing, the Americans include him in a broader catalogue of German military leaders whose expertise might prove useful in the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union, but weeks pass and none of them find him. His former staff is questioned repeatedly. Major Hessler is interrogated by British intelligence at a camp near Lüneburg. He tells them the same thing. He told the Soviets who captured him. First the general was there, and then he wasn't. Hessler seems genuinely bewildered, not evasive. Corporal Iden, the radio operator, confirms the final transmission and nothing more. Sergeant Brandt, the driver, says the general's vehicle was still at the command post when they evacuated. Nobody took it. Meanwhile, in Hamburg, Margaretha Dreschner waits in a half-destroyed apartment building where the windows are covered with cardboard and water comes from a standpipe in the street. She has received no telegram, no official notification, no visit from a uniformed officer. Bearing news, she writes letters to anyone she can think of. Red Cross, the British Occupation Authority, former colleagues of her husband, the replies, when they come at all, say the same thing. We have no information regarding the whereabouts of General Lieutenant Werner Karl Dreschner. Weeks become months. Summer turns to autumn, and Margarethe keeps a candle burning in the window of her ruined apartment, a habit she will maintain for the next 34 years. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, and the wartime alliance fractured into Cold War suspicion, Werner Karl Dreschner became something he never was in life, a mystery worth fighting over. Soviet intelligence was convinced the Americans had him. The logic was straightforward. Dreschner was a skilled tactician with intimate knowledge of Eastern Front operations and Soviet military doctrine. Operation Paperclip had already spirited hundreds of German scientists and military experts to the United States. Why not a general who understood how the Red Army fought the KGB, maintained a file on Dreschner well into the 1960s, updating it periodically with unverified sightings and second-hand rumors, a German matching his description seen in Virginia. Another report placing him at a military advisory facility in Maryland. None of it confirmed, none of it disproven. On the other side, Western intelligence harbored their own suspicions. The Americans believed the Soviets had captured Dreschner and either coerced his cooperation or executed him quietly. A pragmatic German general who understood Soviet weaknesses would have been invaluable to Moscow's military planners or dangerous enough to eliminate CIA analysts, noted in a 1953 memo that Dreschner's disappearance was too clean for a battlefield casualty and too silent for a defection. Someone was hiding something among German veterans. A different set of theories circulated in beer halls and reunions where old soldiers gathered to remember a war they'd lost. Some whispered that Dreschner had used the rat lines. The escape networks run through Austria and Italy that funneled wanted men to Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. He had the rank, the connections, and the motive. Others shook their heads and offered a darker explanation. The SS had been executing officers suspected of defeatism in the war's final weeks, shooting them in fields and cellars and leaving their bodies in unmarked graves. Perhaps Dreschner's quiet skepticism had finally caught up with him. Perhaps someone had overheard the wrong comment at the wrong moment. Every theory had its believers, none had proof. And Werner Karl Dreschner remained exactly what he had been since April 22, 1945. A ghost. Margaretha Dreschner never stopped looking. Not for a single day in the years immediately after the war. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, careful, precise letters in her neat schoolteacher's handwriting to the Red Cross, to the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, to British occupation authorities, to American military liaison offices, to former Wehrmacht officers whose names she found in newspaper reports about prisoner releases. Every letter asked the same question: do you have any information about my husband, General Lieutenant Werner Karl Dreschner, last known location east of Berlin, April 1945? The replies came slowly, if at all. Most were form letters expressing regret and offering nothing. Some were personal notes from men who had served under Werner, saying they wished they could help but couldn't. A few were cruel, anonymous letters accusing her of searching for a war criminal, telling her to let the dead bury the dead. She kept every single one filed chronologically in a series of cardboard boxes that grew year by year. Their son Helmut was 7 when his father disappeared, old enough to remember, old enough to feel the absence like a missing limb. He grew up in post-war Hamburg, where fatherless children were so common. Nobody remarked on it, but Helmut carried it differently. Other boys knew their fathers were dead, buried at Stalingrad or Normandy or in the rubble of Berlin. Helmut didn't know anything, and not knowing was worse than grief. It was a wound that couldn't heal because it couldn't close. Margarethe aged the way people age when hope becomes their primary occupation. Slowly, and then, all at once, by the 1970s, she was frail, her eyesight failing, her letters fewer, but still going out, still asking, still waiting. She died on November 3rd, 1,979 inches, a hospital in Hamburg with Helmut at her bedside. Her last coherent words were about Werner. Not a goodbye, but a question, as if even death couldn't make her stop asking. Helmut inherited the apartment, the letter boxes, and a smaller box he'd never been allowed to open, containing his father's personal correspondence from the front. Most of the letters were what you'd expect a soldier writing home: reassurances about safety, questions about his son, descriptions of weather and boredom, carefully edited to hide the horror. But one letter stood out, dated April 9th, 1945, just 2 weeks before Werner vanished. It contained a line that Helmut read and reread for decades, without understanding. I have made provisions for the worst, my darling. Not the kind you might imagine, but the kind that might let me come back to you. Helmut always assumed it was a poetic way of saying goodbye. Now 87 years old and living quietly in Munich, he had long since stopped expecting answers. He kept the letter in his nightstand drawer and read it every year on his father's birthday, a ritual of remembrance for a man who had simply ceased to exist until a phone call in March 2025 changed everything. March 2025, a logistics company called Brandt und Vogt, GmbH, begins construction on a new distribution warehouse 12 kilometers southeast of Bielitz, Brandenburg. The site is unremarkable flat agricultural land that has been growing potatoes and rapeseed for decades. Before that it was forest, before that it was a war zone. But that's true of most of Brandenburg. The soil here is layered with history in ways that regularly interrupt modern life. Unexploded ordnance is discovered so frequently that construction companies budget for delays the way they budget for rain 3 weeks into the project. On a gray Tuesday morning, a backhoe operator named Klaus Wendt is excavating foundation trenches when his machine drops 6 inches without warning. The bucket has punched through something hard. Beneath the expected soil layer, Wendt backs the machine up and climbs down to look what he sees. Doesn't make sense? A clean edge of poured concrete. Not rubble, not debris, but deliberate engineered construction hidden beneath a meter of topsoil and clay. The foreman, Stefan Muller, takes one look and shuts the site down. Protocol in Brandenburg is clear when you find something underground. You stop and you call the Kampfmittelraumdienst, the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Service, because the last thing you want is a backhoe detonating a Soviet artillery shell that's been sleeping since 1945. The bomb disposal team arrives within 2 hours, expecting the usual: a corroded shell casing, maybe an old ammunition cache, possibly the remains of a collapsed field bunker. What they find instead stops them cold. Beneath the concrete slab is a sealed hatchway, and beneath that, a staircase, narrow, steep, and descending into total darkness. The air that comes up when they crack the seal is stale and cold, carrying a faint chemical smell that one of the technicians later describes as old metal and something else, something organic. The team leader radios back to his command post and says 5 words that will trigger the largest forensic investigation in Brandenburg. Since reunification, we need to go deeper. This isn't ordnance. The first person down the staircase is a bomb disposal technician named Petra Voigt. She's been doing this work for 11 years and has seen her share of underground surprises, collapsed cellars, flooded ammunition stores, once an entire German field hospital sealed behind a brick wall since 1944, but nothing has prepared her for this. The staircase is narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The walls are raw, concrete, poured hastily but competently. The kind of work done by someone who knew what they were doing but didn't have time to make it elegant. 17 steps down, she counts them later for the report, each one slightly uneven. The temperature drops with every step, the air is thick and dead, carrying that strange metallic smell mixed with something earthier, something that speaks of decades of sealed darkness. At the bottom, a short corridor opens into the first of 3 rooms. Voigt sweeps her flashlight across the space, and the beam catches rows of metal shelving lined with supplies, rusted tin cans, their labels long dissolved into brown smears. Glass bottles that once held water now empty the liquid, having evaporated through microscopic gaps in their seals. Over the course of 8 decades, fuel canisters, a folded canvas, tarp, a basic medical kit with bandages and morphine, ampules. Still, in their case, everything arranged with a precision that speaks of military training and careful planning. This wasn't thrown together in panic. This was prepared. The second room is smaller and more personal. A folding military cot with a wool blanket still draped across it, a wooden desk and chair, a kerosene lamp with a blackened glass chimney, a small stack of clothing folded with corners, sharp enough to suggest the man who folded them did so out of lifelong habit, a shaving kit, a canteen, a photograph in a simple frame too, faded to make out clearly from a distance, but clearly showing a woman and a small child on the desk, centered as if it were the most important object in the room, sits a leather journal, its cover dark. With age, its pages brown at the edges, but intact. The forensic team that would later examine it confirmed that the underground conditions, cool, dry, and sealed, had preserved it far better than anyone expected. Then Voigt moves to the third room and stops in the doorway. Her flashlight finds him before her mind fully registers what she's seeing, a figure seated in a chair facing a radio set that takes up most of a small wooden table. The figure is skeletal, the uniform hanging loose where flesh once filled it. The posture is almost peaceful, slightly slumped forward, as if he had fallen asleep, waiting for a signal that never came one. Hand rests on the table near the radio's dial. The other lies in his lap. Voigt stands there for a long moment, the only sound her own breathing and the distant hum of construction equipment far above. Then she keys her radio and says in a voice that is remarkably steady considering the circumstances we have, "Remain, send the forensic team and call the Landescriminal Amt. This is not a military excavation anymore. This is a crime scene or a tomb or both." Within 48 hours, the construction site outside Belitz has been transformed. The warehouse project is indefinitely suspended, replaced by a forensic operation involving the Brandenburg State Police, the Landeskriminalamt, and specialists. From the German Federal Archives, the bunker is treated with the kind of care normally reserved for archaeological sites. Every object photographed in place, before being carefully removed, catalogued and sealed in evidence containers. The skeleton is the priority. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, Dr. Lena Bruckner, conducts her initial examination in situ before the remains are transported to the Institute of Legal Medicine in Potsdam. Her preliminary findings are precise: male, approximately 175 centimeters tall, age at death consistent with late 40 to early 50, no visible trauma to the bones, no fractures, no bullet wounds, no signs of violence. The cause of death would require further analysis, but the absence of injury tells its own story. This man wasn't killed. He died waiting. The uniform is remarkably preserved, protected by the sealed environment. The insignia is unmistakable, the shoulder boards of a Generalleutnant, 2 stars. The collar tabs, the eagle and swastika breast emblem that dates the uniform to the later years of the war. But it's the signet ring that accelerates everything. A heavy gold band on the right hand engraved with 3 letters in an ornate Gothic script. WKD investigators run the initials against every database available. Wehrmacht personnel records captured German military archives, the massive collection at the Deutsche Dienststelle in Berlin, which holds records of more than 18 million German military personnel. The match comes back within a week. Werner Karl Dreschner, Generalleutnant, born the 14th of March, 1896 in Potsdam, last confirmed contact, the 22nd of April, 1945, listed as missing, presumed dead. Since 1949, dental records pulled from surviving Wehrmacht medical files are compared with the remains and confirmed as a positive match 80 years after he transmitted his last message to a command structure that was already collapsing around him. Werner Karl Dreschner has been found not in Argentina, not in a Soviet prison camp, not in an unmarked SS execution grave, but in a hole in the ground less than 40 kilometers from where he sent that final dispatch, sitting beside a radio that would never bring him the signal he needed to hear a man who tried to outlast a war and lost to a concrete hatch that wouldn't open. The journal changes everything. It sits in a Klei mate-controlled evidence room at the Brandenburg State Police headquarters in Potsdam, sealed in a clear archival case, while specialists from the German Federal Archives work through its pages with the painstaking care of people who understand. They are reading a dead man's confession. The leather cover is dark and stiff, the pages inside, browned but legible, preserved by the same sealed, airless conditions that kept the uniform intact and the bones undisturbed. Dreschner wrote in a small, precise hand, using a fountain pen that ran dry partway through, forcing him to switch to pencil. The entries span approximately 3 weeks, beginning April 22, 1945, the same day as his final radio transmission to Wehrmacht High Command. The first entry is written with the controlled clarity of a man executing a plan he has thought through carefully. I have left my post tonight not out of cowardice, but out of the conviction that dying for a lost cause is not duty. It is waste. The war is finished. Everyone who can see clearly knows this. I will not surrender to the Soviets, who will send me to Siberia or shoot me in a ditch. I will not flee west and beg the Americans for mercy. Like a dog, I will wait. The journal reveals what no intelligence agency, no conspiracy theorist, and no grieving family member ever guessed. Dreschner hadn't been captured, recruited, or killed. He had deserted on his own terms months before his disappearance. He had quietly commissioned a bunker to be built on a piece of farmland he had identified during a reconnaissance survey. The work was done by a military engineer named Oberleutnant Roll F. Bremer, a man Dreschner trusted completely. Bremer supervised a small team of forced laborers who were told they were constructing an auxiliary communications post. The laborers were later transferred to other units and scattered across the panned, collapsing front. Bremer himself was killed during the Soviet assault on Silo Heights on April 17, 5 days before Dreschner sealed himself underground with Bremer dead. No living person knew the bunker existed, and that was exactly what Dreschner intended. The plan was methodical, almost elegant. In its simplicity, he would enter the bunker with enough food and water for 6 weeks, a radio to monitor the progress of the war above, and a hatch mechanism that would allow him to exit from the inside. Once the fighting had moved past his position, he would emerge into the post-war chaos, shed his uniform, blend into the flood of refugees, and make his way to Hamburg, where Margrethe was waiting. He had even packed civilian clothes, the folded garments found in the second room. He thought of everything except the one thing that would kill him. The journal's tone shifts on April 29th, 1 week after Dreschner sealed himself inside. The first entries are measured, almost calm. The writing of a man who believes he has outsmarted the catastrophe above him. He notes his supplies, catalogs his rations, and records his radio monitoring schedule. Every 4 hours he powers on the set and scans frequencies looking for military communications, news broadcasts, anything that will tell him what is happening on the surface. But on the 29th, the entry is different. The radio has pepped receiving. I have checked every connection, replaced the antenna wire and adjusted frequencies across the full spectrum. Nothing the set powers on but receives only static. I do not know if the problem is the equipment or the depth of earth above me. The silence is more unnerving than any bombardment. What Dreschner couldn't have known was that the heavy Soviet shelling that rolled across Brandenburg in late April had done more than shake the ground above his bunker. It had shifted the earth and concrete around his hatch. The mechanism, designed to be opened from inside by releasing a counterweighted concrete panel, had been jammed shut by tons of displaced soil pressing down from above. Dreschner discovered this on May 1st. When he made his first attempt to leave, the hatch will not open. I have applied full force to the release mechanism without result. Something above has shifted. The weight is beyond what the lever can overcome. I will try again with tools. The entries after May 1st are the hardest to read. Dreschner, the precise, methodical tactician, gives way to something raw, a man fighting panic with discipline. He describes using a tire iron from the supply room to pry at the hatch frame, working in shifts, because the air grows thin when he exerts himself. He rations food, cutting his intake to 1 meal a day. He calculates and recalculates how long his supplies will last. The water is the concern, not the food. He writes about Margrethe, about Helmut, about the life he imagined they would live after the war. A small house somewhere quiet, maybe near the coast where Helmut could grow up. He ring waves instead of sirens. He writes about regret, not for leaving his post, but for not telling anyone where he was going. The one precaution that was supposed to protect him, the absolute secrecy, had become the thing that would destroy him. The final dated entry is May 14th, 1945. 2 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, an event that happened in the world above, while Werner Karl Dreschner sat in darkness with no way to hear it. The entry is short. I believe the war may be over. I have heard nothing in days, which itself may be the sign the fighting has stopped. I cannot open the hatch. I have tried everything. I have enough water for perhaps 3 more days after that. I do not know. I am sorry, Marguerite. I tried to come home. The pencil trails off at the end of the line, as if his hand simply stopped moving. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side about the German general is even more insane.